Which is a better reply for black to white's opener 1h3? 1a6 or 1e5? Incorrect. The advance a7-a6 pays no attention to the center, and it doesn't build development. It guards b5, but this might be meaningless in the course of the ensuing game. Such a rook-pawn beginning doesn't fight fire with fire. Rather, it ensures that black gets burned too. Correct. This is the best retort. Black occupies a key central square, e5, and snarls at another, d4. Additionally, black can now develop both the queen and king bishop. In responding this way, black steals the initiative from white, who futilely wasted his first move by moving the king-rook pawn. Which is a better reply to white's 1f3? 1e5 or 1e6? Correct. It's usually a good policy to move the king pawn out 2 squares if the opportunity arises. It aggresses the center and prepares the activation of 2 pieces, the queen and king bishop. And with f3 obstructed by a pawn, white loses one of the best ways to assail black's e5 pawn, a knight development to f3. Incorrect. This is not a bad move. It speeds up development and deals with the center, but it's not as aggressive as moving the e-pawn 2 squares forward. It also blocks black's own forces a little bit, especially the c8 bishop along the clogged c8-h3 diagonal. Generally, the further ahead you advance your center pawns, the more space you have behind the lines to maneuver and deploy. Which is a better black response to 1g4? 1d5 or 1 knight f6? Correct. This strikes at a central square, e4, and establishes a beachhead on another, d5. Moreover, the diagonal line of black's queen bishop is now cleared, and to a starving bishop, white's g4 pawn looks like a tasty morsel. Incorrect. Here is a case where good intentions backfire. Black develops a piece with a threat to g4, but the fox becomes the hound, and the hound the fox, after white replies by moving the pawn to g5 with a pincer counter to black's knight. Not every developing move is propitious. Let's make this clearer. Is a development good if it allows you to be mated in one move? Of course, this is overstating our case here, for knight g8 f6 doesn't lead to black getting checkmated. But both players have to consider the consequences of each turn, especially in the first few moves of a game, when the fight is for ultimate control and a faulty step can lose valuable time and therefore the initiative. Which is a better response for black to 1b4? 1b5 or 1a5? Incorrect. This may seem to put black in the same boat as white, but it's black's side that will probably sink first. Symmetrical play, where black copies white, is very dangerous, for there are no last licks in chess. If you're checkmated, you don't then get the opportunity to tie the score by checkmating your opponent. What's a better try for black? Moving either center pawn 2 squares or developing the king-knight. All of these draw on sound principles and make sense. Correct. While not particularly a commendable thrust, a7-a5 threatens to take the b-pawn and prepares to open the a file, clearing the file for the a8 rook. You can open a file by exchanging pawns, and usually, in order to exchange a pawn, you must first advance it. Still, a7, a5 here is superior to the static b7, b5, which merely apes white without particular benefit. If you must be active or passive, be active and make things happen. When you lose, at least you can say you did it your way. Which is a better reply for black to 1 knight c3, 1 knight c6, or 1 d5? Incorrect. This copycat play is okay, but it doesn't allow black to stamp the position with distinctive character. If you want to outplay your opponent, don't rely on emulating his moves, which in effect says you're content to draw the game. Do something different, then try to make your ideas work better than your opponent's. Correct. Black's direct assault on the center, d7, d5, usurps space and opens paths for the queen and queen bishop. It also arms black with the option of advancing further, d5, d4, against white's c3 knight. This would probably lead to a loss of time, as white's beleaguered knight scurries to safety. It also makes a statement. By being bold and direct and different, black announces his unwillingness to draw. He wants more. Which is a better answer to 1 e4, 1 e5, or 1 g5? Correct. Although this is a symmetrical response, it's still a very good move that attacks the center, gains space, opens lines for development, and establishes a physical presence at the frontier. Incorrect. True, it prepares to fianchetto the king-bishop at g7, but that's just about its only value point. It weakens black's king side, especially f5, f6, h5, and h6, for black's g-pawn can no longer guard these squares for the remainder of the game. This makes them inviting to marauders, lying in wait for black to castle kingside. Furthermore, the g-pawn itself actually becomes vulnerable to white's bellicose attack force. Which is a better counter to 1 e4, 1 knight a6, or 1 c5? Incorrect. It doesn't attack the center. It places the knight on a vulnerable square, and it confines the steed to a rather small corral of only 4 squares. From a6, the knight attacks just b4, c5, c7, and b8. And not that he would want to, but after 1 knight b8 a6, white always has the option of exchanging light square bishop for a6 knight. Bishop f1 takes a6, impairing black's pawn structure at whim. Finally, chess is supposed to be a logical game. You play a move, your opponent replies, and you answer your opponent's response. Thrust and parry. The Jejun development 1 knight b8 a6, however, is simply not pertinent to white's opener 1 e4. It doesn't relate, and in chess that's the worst crime of all. Correct. This is called the Sicilian defense, 1 e4 c5, and has become a staple of the contemporary tournament player. Although its only immediate contribution to development is to clear the a5 d8 diagonal for black's queen, It strikes at the heart of the center, d4, with asymmetrical fervor. It also prepares to exchange the c-pawn for white's d-pawn once white advances the d-pawn to d4. This would result in black having more pawns remaining on the central files than white. Black would retain the d and e pawns, white only the e pawn. Generally, if you have more pawns in a region, you have an excellent chance to wrest control of the region. And what better place to have dominance than in the center? For black, which is a better retort to 1e4? 1e6 or 1h6? Correct. It strikes at the center, d5. It clears two splendid diagonals, d8 h4 for the queen and a3 f8 for the dark square bishop. And it supports the advance d7 d5. Its name is the French defense, and its chief liability is the blocking in of the c8 bishop, which French defense enthusiasts typically refer to as the problem bishop. Incorrect. This move is inappropriate. It disregards the center. It adds nothing to development, and it weakens g6 by removing a crucial defender of that square, the once h7 pawn. Moves like pawn to rook 3 are usually played to dissuade the intrusion of enemy minor pieces. But such defensive play is often unnecessary, and here it makes no sense whatsoever. Which is a better way for black to answer white's 1e4? 1c6 or 1f6? Correct. This is called the Caro-Kann defense, 1e4c6. And like the Sicilian defense, 1e4c5 clears the a5 d8 diagonal for black's queen. But it differs from the Sicilian in that instead of striking at d4, it supports the counterattack d7 d5, which opposes white's e-pawn. The expansive Sicilian tends to be played by those who enjoy sharp fights, while the compact Caro-Kann appeals more to those striving for solidarity and position play. Incorrect. This is just a bad move. It doesn't build black's game, in fact it retards it by blocking f6, and it endangers black's king by injuring two diagonals, a2 g8 and e8 h5. The square g6 is also weakened, which can't help black very much either. If there's any one move that smacks of inexpertness, this is it. Which is a better response to white's 1e4? 1d5 or 1f5? Correct. This is the center counter defense, 1e4 d5, where black wastes no time at getting to the middle. It clears developing routes for the c8 bishop and the queen, and it menaces white's e-pawn. Its chief drawback is that it usually implies the early development of black's queen, which could lead to chessic harassment against Her Majesty. But it does signify a fight, and not all the tactics go white's way. Incorrect. This gambit, an opening sacrifice, usually of a pawn for attack and initiative, is too aggressive and quite hazardous. After white's e-pawn takes black's f-pawn, 2e4 takes f5, white envisions a serious queen check at h5, when white's pawn at f5 presents a safe block at g6 because of f5 takes g6. nor can we say that black gains developmental possibilities because of this premature thrust. It just doesn't work. Which is a better way to reply to 1d4? 1 knight f6 or 1 knight h6? Correct. This is an excellent developing move, activating the king-knight toward the center. Meanwhile, it deals with white's primary opening plan, which is to establish a classical pawn center, two center pawns on the E and D files aligned on their own fourth rank. With knight g8 f6, white is unable to advance his e-pawn 2 squares, for black now controls e4. Incorrect. This is another one of those developing moves that fail to add very much to black's game. It doesn't fight for the center, and the knight at h6 is a potential target. White can actually remove it right now. 2 bishop c1 takes h6, busting up black's kingside. See how much fun castling kingside is after that. But white doesn't have to capture anything to acquire advantage. Since placing the knight on h6 doesn't pressure or restrict white in any way, he is free to follow up by advancing his e-pawn 2 squares, creating a formidable pawn center. Thereafter, white will be able to develop all his pieces without having to move another pawn. That's maximum efficiency. Which is a better response to white's 1d4? 1d5 or 1b6? Correct. This is a fine retort, producing what's known as a double queen pawn opening. That's where both sides start the game by moving out their d-pawns 2 squares, so that each obstructs its enemy counterpart. Black's reply also meets head-on white's plan to advance the king pawn to e4. Now if white were to play 2e4, black would take white's pawn for free. 2d takes e4. Incorrect. This is not a terrible move per se. It doesn't ignore the center or development, for black aims to post the queen-bishop at b7, where it assails the center from the flank. But it's slower than d7, d5, and it doesn't stop white from setting up an ideal two-pawn center with 2 e2, e4. Correct. This is a fine retort, producing what's known as a double queen pawn opening. That's where both sides start the game by moving out their d-pawns 2 squares. Incorrect. This is not a terrible move per se. It doesn't ignore the center or development, for black aims to post the queen-bishop at b7, where it assails the center from the flank. But it's slower than d7, d5, and it doesn't stop white from setting up an ideal two-pawn center with 2 e2, e4. After 1 d4, which is a better reply by black? 1 f5 or 1 f6? Correct. This signifies the Dutch defense. 1 d4 f5. Black moves out his f-pawn to control e4 and to dissuade white from advancing his king-pawn 2 squares ahead. Its chief frailty is the slight weakening to the e8, h5 diagonal, although black is quite able to cope with whatever white can throw at him. But he should be vigilant, even at so early a stage. Incorrect. This has essentially the same weaknesses as f7, f5, with none of its attributes. Most notably, it is less aggressive, and black does not deter white from pushing the e-pawn to e4. White thus obtains a menacing pawn center and a powerful initiative, and it doesn't cost him anything. Which is a superior response to 1d4? 1g6 or 1g5? Correct. The wing push prepares to fianchetto the king-bishop at g7, where it would strike at the dark squares in the center. This manner of developing the king-bishop illustrates a contemporary approach to central play, in which opposing strategies come to immediate loggerheads. Black permits white to achieve his ends without an upfront fight, but then proceeds to snipe at white with guerrilla tactics. In other words, black allows white to assume a two-pawn center at once with 2e4, and each player accordingly makes a statement. White in effect says that his center is strong, and that it confers an overall advantage. This opposes black's philosophy, which essentially proclaims that white's pawn center is vulnerable. This is why black surrenders the middle without an initial fight. He believes that as white tries to keep his pressured center intact, black can force his opponent into concessions, such as awkward protections or weakening advances. By getting his heart's desire, the pawn center, so easily, white thereby acquires something to worry about: losing the center. Which strategy is correct? Seizing the center or abandoning it with purpose? Neither and both. The reality is, whoever executes his plan with more skill and accuracy and with more courage and vision will probably triumph. Incorrect. This move enables black to flank his king-bishop, as does g7-g6. But unlike g7-g6, it incurs serious weaknesses, particularly to f5 and h5. These squares will be deprived of the g-pawn's protection for the balance of the game. White's pieces could have a field day invading on and around these susceptible points. Other nearby squares tend to be softened and affected by these adjacent weaknesses. But worse than all this is the fact that one g7-g5 hangs a pawn to the c1 bishop. Black drops it. 2 bishop c1 takes g5 with no compensation. Which is a better response to 1d4? 1c5 or 1e5? Correct. On the surface, this looks like a pawn sacrifice, for white can simply take the c-pawn. 2d4 takes c5. Black, however, has a riposte to get the pawn back. 2 queen a5 check. After white blocks the check, black's queen can recapture the c-pawn. Yet it's a trade-off. Black obtains more pawns in the center, one on the d-file and one on the e-file, while white keeps only his e-pawn. But in landing this advantage, black has wasted time, for he's moved his queen twice, and that's not usually a productive way to develop in the opening. Incorrect. This is a pawn sacrifice with little juice, and black has no reliable way to attempt to get the pawn back. After 2d4 takes e5, white's extra pawn actually inhibits black's central maneuvering. When one offers a pawn, it's usually to gain attack and time. But black's offering here doesn't tangibly help his development, and white still keeps the initiative. What kind of gambit is this? Which is a better answer to 1 knight f3? 1 knight c6 or 1 knight f6? Incorrect. Actually, this is a very good move. It attacks the center and develops toward it. It doesn't engender any weaknesses, and it takes steps to prepare queenside castling. If it has any drawback whatsoever, it's that it blocks the c-pawn before it can be determined if an early movement of the c-pawn is desirable. Why reduce your options by playing unnecessarily committal moves? Rather, it makes sense to play flexibly, giving away as little information as possible, and keeping a full range of choices for as long as you can. Correct. I prefer this move. It develops a knight toward the central hub, and it prepares kingside castling, which is more usual than queenside castling because it tends to be quicker. In addition, it's not as committing as one knight b8 c6, for it obstructs the f-pawn, not the c-pawn, and it's far less necessary to retain the option of moving the f-pawn early in the game. There's always an element of precariousness in moving the f7 pawn or the f2 pawn for white, for in so doing, black exposes the king to possible danger along the e8 h5 diagonal. Moving the c-pawn, however, merely uncovers the queen along the a5 d8 diagonal. The queen can fend for itself by guarding the line it already occupies, but the king is totally vulnerable to distant linear threats. Which is a better answer to 1g3, 1d5, or 1b5? Correct. This establishes a foothold in the center, seizing the square e4. It also clears developmental paths for the queen and queen-bishop, while carrying no real weaknesses. Incorrect. Like d7, d5, b7, b5 attacks the square c4, but this is not particularly germane or helpful here. And while the advance b7, b5 prepares an excursion of the c8 bishop to b7 from where it looks in on the center, the move is quite weakening, primarily to a5 and c5, as well as a6 and c6. Furthermore, on b5, the b-pawn just sits out there, prone to white's queenside ambitions. Which is a better answer to 1c4, 1e5, or 1d5? Correct. The thrust of black's king-pawn to e5 is good standard fare. It concerns the center. It builds developing capabilities, and is consistent with the plan of early kingside castling. Incorrect. This is often a good move, but here it falters, for it allows white to take black's d-pawn with the c-pawn. Once black takes back on d5, white winds up with a pawn majority on the central files of 2-1. This should give white greater opportunities in the center, for it tends to be easier to establish control when you possess more soldiers. Then there's the matter of how black takes back. If he does so at once, queen d8 takes d5, his queen is suddenly susceptible to assault. The development 3 knight b1 c3 then serves nicely, and black must waste time transferring his queen to safety. And if he doesn't do it immediately, instead delaying the recapture for a move with knight g8 f6, white can try guarding the extra queen pawn by 3 e2 e4. It appears that the e-pawn is then hanging for free. But if black's knight takes on e4, 3 knight f6 takes e4, white's queen check at a4 picks up the e4 knight. Which is a better response to 1 f4? 1 e5 or 1 g5? Correct. This is a fine retort, though it's obviously a gambit, for white can take black's pawn for free. 2 f4 takes e5. But it's not so simple, for after black follows with the advance of the d-pawn, 2 d7 d6, it's likely an exchange will take place. 3 e takes d6, bishop takes d6, that fuels black's attack. White must be careful in that his first move, 1 f2 f4, doesn't develop anything while potentially exposing the king to aggression along the e1 h4 diagonal. That's why after black reacts with 1 e7 e5, many players prefer transposing to a king's gambit by declining the sacrifice. This white does by continuing 2 e2 e4, which tries to sap black's offer with a counter gambit. The f4 pawn is the bait. Incorrect. This is a gambit all right, but not an efficacious one. For after 2 f4 takes g5, black's position looks as bad as it actually is. There are weak squares, f5, h5, and h6, and vulnerable diagonals, e8 h5 and d3 h7. And there's no place to develop the king-knight. f6 and h6 are guarded. Junk this gambit. Don't pass go, and start again. Which is a better response to 1b3? 1g6 or 1e5? Incorrect. This is actually a perfectly acceptable move. I question it merely because it could lead to slight discomfort after white flanks the queen-bishop to bishop c1 b2, menacing the rook at h8. Black will then have to block the attack, say by 2 knight g8 f6, but that places the knight in a vexatious pin. It can't move without exposing the h8 rook. Black can deal with this, though it might result in the disruption of his kingside pawn structure or the premature trade of his own king-bishop after, for example, 3 knight b1 c3 bishop f8 g7, 4 knight c3 d5. But it's entirely playable, so try it if you will, but be prepared to cope with the consequences. Start by trying to understand what they are. Correct. This is preferable to 1 g6 here, even though on e5 the king pawn becomes a target for white's dark square bishop. But black has resources, and he can hold his e-pawn and the early space edge it confers, though white still has the initiative by virtue of starting with the first move.